everyone, my name's Emily York and I'm the Youth Programme Manager here at the Mighty Creatives, where I also manage our Creative Mentoring Programme, a programme offering one-to-one support for children and young people who are in and or leaving care to work with a creative mentor, exploring emotional challenges from a creative distance. This model of working was pioneered by Derbyshire Virtual School and the Amber Factory and has been well embedded within Derbyshire Virtual School's provision over a number of years. If you'd like to find out more about creative mentoring and our programme, please just email us, myself or Louise, at creativementoring@themightycreatives.com and we will answer any of your questions. This video has been put together to help share our exciting research programme with What Works for Children's Social Care and King's College London. Whilst we know the real power of creative mentoring and the impact it can have on children and young people's lives, this rigorous research programme will help us to deliver robust research into the efficacy of creative mentoring to help to ensure that more children and young people have access to creative mentoring now and in the future. The programme itself will provide creative mentoring to a group of looked after children and young people and care leavers between the ages of 15 and 18, with the aim to reawaken aspirations, explore possibilities, reimagine futures, build employability skills and develop confidence through positive socialisation. The research design, led by colleagues at King's College London's Evidence Development and Incubation Team, also known as EDIT, consists of what is called a two-armed randomised controlled trial, where a group of children and young people will be selected at random to either receive creative mentoring and be part of the treatment group or work with EDIT for the purposes of the research, the control group. This approach is widely used to test the impact of specific programmes and is the best way to compare both quantitative and qualitative outcomes. Using this approach, we will be measuring how creative mentoring impacts children and young people's educational attainment, educational qualifications, behaviours towards peers and professionals, ability to develop relationships with peers and professionals, self-esteem, resilience and well-being. Using a randomised controlled trial provides a strong basis on which to identify what impact creative mentoring has exactly had for children and young people who have taken part. It also ensures virtual schools who participate will know whether creative mentoring is effective for young people in their area, which will help allocate funding to practices that have been proven to work for their children and young people. And the randomised controlled trial approach has been approved by King's College London's Research Ethics Committee. We have the opportunity through this programme to work with 240 children and young people aged 15 to 18, and it's a great opportunity for their development, their lives, and to better shape the provision to benefit current and future generations. If you are interested in referring to this programme, please get in touch with myself, Emily York, by emailing us at creativementoring@themightycreatives.com. But if you want to hear more about the trial itself, please stay tuned and hear from our colleague Susanna Hume, Director of Evaluation in the Policy Institute at King's College London, about why an RCT is the best evaluation method and how it can benefit your virtual school. That's it from me. If you have any questions, please do get in touch, but I hope to hear from you soon. Bye.
So just to get started, my team in the Policy Institute specialises on evaluation and supporting the development of evidence. We're particularly interested in complex interventions and in education research. So we kind of take on three types of projects. The first one is around supporting organisations to develop their evaluation capacity and expertise and enable them to create, stronger evidence of a variety of types themselves. We also work with organisations that are looking to understand how they could scale and provide concrete recommendations around how they might do that. And then the third one is we run evaluations of complex interventions or interventions that are occurring in a complex environment. And the reason why I think this is worth flagging or worth kind of mentioning up front that this is our approach to evaluation is, although we sit in an institution, is very much led by the needs of the project rather than, some kind of arbitrary academic standard. That may or may not work in practice. So what really interests us and what we really like working on is projects that require that benefit from a sort of innovative and pragmatic approach to evaluation that combines both the kind of benefits of having something that has been designed in quite a robust way in terms of, you know, the standard of evidence that produces that the project can then take forward, or the program can then take forward, but also with a slightly more sort of in the round approach that might combine methods and approaches in a way that works for the project, but wouldn't necessarily be what other academic evaluators might take as an approach. So that is kind of, I think, that was one of the reasons why we were particularly interested in this program. We also, as a team, have a history of being interested in the creative arts and in creative opportunities. So I worked for a while in government in Australia on cultural diplomacy and arts programs internationally, as did my colleague Miriam, who's also on this, although she worked for the German Foreign Office on that. And so the evaluation team has a kind of history of interest in this area, which I think was one of the reasons, again, why we were sort of keen to evaluate it. The other interesting component here is that the complexity of the theory of change here, or the sort of model by which this program produces impact, really led us towards a much more qualitative approach than you would generally see in an impact evaluation like this. So we are conducting interviews with both the treated and control, with people in both the treated and control groups, which will enable us in a way which I think will be quite exciting to not only map the differences in outcomes, but also the differences in how participants who've engaged with creative mentoring sort of see themselves, see the world around them, and see their own narrative and their future prospects compared to the participants in the control group, which I think will provide a really important kind of wraparound for this program that we're, you know, kind of quite excited to pursue. So that's kind of the approach that the team takes, which very much starts from the program and thinks what is the fairest and best way to evaluate this, rather than looking to a sort of academic standard and then going, how can we kind of drop this on top of a program where it may or may not fit. So to kind of take you through this, I think one challenge that programs in particular often experience when they get an evaluation is they start with a research question, which, you know, for example, might be, how does the creative mentoring program impact educational attainment for young people who are children looked after or care leavers? And then something happens, and at the end of it, there is a kind of yes, no, inconclusive, maybe some comments about subgroups, and maybe some comments about how the program was implemented, and there is kind of a black box in the middle where it's quite hard for everybody to sort of see how the research question has led to the findings, and that makes it quite hard to disentangle these sort of insights at a level below that. So one of the things that the approach that we take, and also the approach that What Works for Children Social Care takes, is to try and sort of open up that black box and make the process of going from a research question to research findings really transparent. And Emily may agree, in some cases, like slightly frighteningly transparent, because we even go to the extent of saying what the kind of, you know, the specification of the regression equations is going to be in some cases. But there are other ways that we do that. So first of all, we work on developing a logic model, which is basically an agreed framework for how the inputs and the context of the program sort of flow through mechanisms and activities and to outcomes. And what that means is that when we start getting down into the weeds of how the analysis is going to be specified, what the outcome measures are, and all of those sorts of things, we're working off an agreed sort of framework at the level of what is this program, how does it work, and what is it going to change. And then we kind of work from that to, you know, sort of robust outcome measures and methods, and to the kind of appropriate configuration of methods, the balance on the impact of the program versus the process of implementing the program, how it was experienced, why, you know, people might have responded to it in a different way. And so we sort of try and open up the black box so that you can kind of see how the research question has flowed through a logic model, through a sort of theory of why the program works, into the outcome measures and methods, into the relative focus on the different strands, and then into research findings. And this is good, I think, for programs because you just get a much greater richness of insight. It's also good for the credibility of the evaluation because transparency on all of this stuff up front means that when we come to the end and we have a finding, we can say we did all of this analysis the way that we thought we would before we saw the data or before the program was implemented, and that gives I think a level of credibility to the evaluation that is really valuable. It's worth noting also that this is a process that What Works for Children Social Care requires. We're very much bought in on it, but it is the required evaluation approach for What Works for Children Social Care, which is the development of a logic model, the specification of a trial protocol, which documents the sort of evaluation in detail, and so we work in that way as well. So when we're thinking about the logic model, basically what that does is turn the pathway from the idea of an intervention into the outcomes of the intervention into a structured approach. And so you kind of divide up all of these different elements, like the situation and the aim and the activities, and you work through them in a systematic way. So this is what the logic model looks like for creative mentoring, which I won't go through in piles of detail because I think first of all we can share it with you if you're particularly interested in it. You may also have seen it already, but I think the key things is that the interventions and the outcomes in particular drive the both the process evaluation. So when we talk to young people, what do we kind of ask them about? What sort of pathways do we sort of try and map through their experience of the program? But also it really drives the outcome measures that we use in the impact evaluation. So you'll see that the outcomes that we expect creative mentoring to achieve are improved mental and emotional well-being, greater engagement in their education via sort of attendance enrollment, greater educational attainment, and then a long-term benefit that flows onto, which is young people have better prospects and are less likely to be NEET. And then down on the sort of mentoring side, we sort of capture also the benefits for mentors. So we then we work from that to outcome measures, which is basically, as this says, we'll know that an outcome is reached when we see a particular indicator. So we'll know that young people are experiencing better well-being when we get the well-being measure that we're using and we see that it looks more positive. So these are the outcomes that we're using for this program. So the primary outcome is, as mentioned previously, the highest level qualification the individual has received by the end of the 2021-22 academic year. And then our secondary outcomes, and basically this is a discipline that that we sort of impose on ourselves, and What Works for Children Social Care imposes on us is to basically say what is the most important or significant thing that this program could achieve for young people, and then that becomes our primary outcome. So here we think that the most important or significant achievement would be a higher level of qualification. Because that would be a huge accomplishment, basically, and we want to make sure that the trial is designed to pick that up if it's happened. And then we have our secondary outcomes, which are things that are important, but that we think are sort of a less important achievement, basically. So those are educational enrolment, behaviours and relationships with professionals and peers, self-esteem, resilience and well-being, and those are very much mapped to the outcomes in the theory of change. And then we also pick up our process indicators, and these are usually structured more as research questions because, the process of coming to a conclusion on them is much more judgment-based and exploratory and sort of adaptive as we go through the evaluation. So the process indicators that we're focusing on are: to what extent does delivery in different settings adhere to the logic model? So has the program actually happened the way that we expected it to when we mapped the logic model? What are the enabling factors and barriers to the program's success, both at the organizational institutional level and at the individual level, the level of the participants and the mentors? Have there been any planned or unplanned changes to delivery in any of the settings, and what have been the consequences of those? And then we look at what has been the experience of the program. So how have young people experienced the program? How has it kind of caused them to think about themselves differently or to express themselves differently? Have they enjoyed the program? Would they recommend the program? How did they see the impacts of the program as having been for them? and likewise for mentors and other stakeholders. And then the third set are around the mechanisms. So is there a perception that the program is more effective for different groups? So across mentors, staff, young people, do they kind of have a sense that this program is more for, you know, some young people or some mentors or that sort of thing than others? Have there been any unintended consequences which could be positive or potentially negative? And so we would want to pick those up if they've happened. So that's kind of the overarching scope of what we're trying to answer with this evaluation, is basically what are the impacts of creative mentoring on these indicators, and then what has the process of creative mentoring in the project been, and, you know, and how have we seen it sort of be implemented and experienced. So I'm going to concentrate a bit on the impact side, and particularly the kind of question of how do you demonstrate impact for a program like this. So one thing that, if you kind of take a sort of more qualitative or general quantitative approach, so one thing, what you kind of try to do is hold everything constant except for the presence of creative mentoring. And there's a few ways we could do that, but one way we could do it is to just look at the outcomes of participants on the program, either before and after they were on the program, or we could compare outcomes of participants on the programs to other participants in their school, or to those who, you know, applied but weren't shortlisted via a kind of shortlisting mechanism. But we have challenges with that. And I kind of, as an illustrative example, imagine we've got two people. What we can see about them is that they are 18, female, they're from a minority ethnic background, and they go to the same school. And they've both, let's say, potentially applied for creative mentoring. So if we look at these two people based on everything that we can observe about them, they look like pretty good matches for each other. And so if we put, you know, the person on the left into creative mentoring and the person on the right was not eligible or did not get a place, we might think that we would be in a pretty good position to compare the outcomes of those two. So let's say the person on the left who went to creative mentoring, you know, enrolled in a further education level 3 qualification, and the person on the right became NEET. We might think we're in a pretty good position to say that that was the effect of creative mentoring, because everything we can observe about these two participants is very similar, and, you know, they might also come from low-income neighbourhoods. But the problem is that there are a lot of other factors that we can't observe that might affect both their likelihood of being in the creative mentoring program, engaging with it really well, and their likelihood of achieving the outcomes. So, for example, if our person on the left, who was the one who re-enrolled in a further education college, likes her social worker, has a really good, you know, her family has a really good dynamic with the social worker, you know, and there's a really positive relationship there, and the person on the left doesn't have that kind of positive relationship, or her family doesn't have that positive relationship with their social worker, it's very, very hard for us to observe that or quantify it, but it's a factor that is very likely to affect both the extent to which the person on the left, who is now teal, the teal person, goes on to creative mentoring, but also her likelihood of engaging in education. And you can think of lots of examples like this. So, for example, if a person kind of knows what they want to do with their life and knows that education would help them with that, if they've got a more supportive family in a variety of ways, if their, you know, engagement with school, their social habits, their friend group, you know, sort of changed at the same time, that might influence both their likelihood of being selected onto creative mentoring, because they might have a, you know, they might look like a better candidate for it, and their likelihood of re-engaging with or engaging with education. And the problem with this approach, where we try to hold everything constant, is that in practice there is always going to be things that we can't observe, and therefore we can't know have been held constant. And so if we go back to our sort of, I'll know the outcome is reached when I see the indicator, we need to consider other factors that might affect the indicator. And we kind of talk about these in terms of being observables or observable factors, which are things we can build into the evaluation and we can kind of control out, which basically means we kind of build them into the quantitative model, and therefore their impact is separated from the impact of the intervention, which are things like observed behaviour, measured attitudes, demographic characteristics, and those kinds of things we can see. But what we really need to be worried about are the unobservables, or the unobservable factors, which are the things we can't observe, either because they're just intrinsically unobservable, or because it would be just impossibly onerous and complicated to try and measure them or observe them, make them observed. So these are things like, so the classic example is motivation, unobserved behavior, unmeasured attitudes, things that influence the outcome that we don't know about or can't measure. And the problem with most forms of impact evaluation is that if you can't make a clear case that you have dealt with these unobservables in some way, people won't believe that the outcome that you see is a result of the intervention and not a result of these unobservable factors. So we call this selection bias, which is basically that there is some kind of potential bias in the selection mechanism that has put people into the treatment group, into the creative mentoring in this case, which has brought a whole bunch of other unobservable factors into play that we don't know what the effect of them has been. And there are some classic examples of this. So this website is basically collects things that are just correlated with each other, where it's just definitely not as a result of a causal relationship. So I don't think we believe that eating more mozzarella cheese makes people more likely to be awarded civil engineering doctorates. But if we don't think about the role of unobservables or unobserved factors, then, and we just look at the correlation between them, the correlation is really high. So this is kind of, what we're trying to deal with in the design that we've proposed, is how do you design an evaluation that plausibly and credibly says to other people, we've done our best to isolate the impact of the intervention of creative mentoring from the impact of all of the other factors that might influence our outcomes. So this is why we've proposed a randomized controlled trial, because they are one way to try and address the impact of unobservable factors. They're not the only way, but they are, when they're designed well and when they're appropriate to the context, they are one of the best ways. So what we do with a randomized controlled trial, so if we have a program like creative mentoring where we've got 120 places and we've got 240 people who might benefit from those and have been put forward, the sort of conventional way that would happen then would be that organizations, so the Mighty Creatives, virtual schools, you would go through a process of triaging, basically, who's most likely to benefit, who's most likely to engage, and then those people would go on the program, and then we'd have a group of people who didn't go on the program even though they were put forward for it. But those two groups would be quite different from each other, because there would be something about the people who were on the program that kind of suggested that they were most likely to be the people who benefited, which might be some of those factors that we talked about before. And so if we just do a straight comparison of those two groups, people won't believe that the difference in outcomes is because of the program, or what component of it. We won't know what component of the difference in outcomes is because of the program versus because the people who were most likely to go on to further education to good outcomes were the people who ended up on the program. So what we do instead is we split the group in half. So the 240 people who have been put forward for it, so they're eligible, they might benefit. This might be a really great opportunity for them. We split them in half via random lot, and this is because if we split people in half via random lot and the allocation mechanism is random, then we can assume that there are no systematic differences between the groups. So we won't put everybody who's most likely to engage in education in the treatment group, because via the mechanism of randomness, half of them will end up in the control group. And so if we do this, then what we can say is the change in the average outcome between the control and the treatment group, we can attribute confidently, with a level of confidence, to the benefits of being engaged in creative mentoring. So that is kind of the logic by which we propose a randomized controlled trial as an impact mechanism here. So, and we think that there are several reasons why, particularly in this case, an RCT is the right way to go. So it provides a strong basis on which to identify what impact creative mentoring has had for participants, both quantitatively and qualitatively, because we are also speaking to both treated and controlled participants in interviews. So we will also be able to get an idea of how the differences in their narratives about themselves and about their sort of experience and their prospects diverge. For virtual schools, if you participate, you'll know in future whether creative mentoring is effective for children who are looked after and care leavers in your area, which will help you allocate funding to practices that work. So what we'll produce is a kind of report of the effectiveness of creative mentoring overall. But if young people in your area are in that, you will actually know for your area whether this is an intervention that works. So there are real benefits to participating in the randomized controlled trial and not just kind of holding off. Participants who are put forward and then allocated to the control group will still have the opportunity to receive rewards in return for survey completion, and they will be able to participate in creative mentoring in the future. So we're not denying them creative mentoring, we're just putting off the time when they can do it in order to be able to evaluate whether it's a good investment of their time and resources and those sorts of things. And that was really important to us. So in this area around educational attainment, generally speaking, the most robust way to do this is to withhold the intervention in perpetuity, because if we say if you're in the control group you can never access creative mentoring, we can follow the outcomes of the program well into the future. So we could go back and look, in 5 or 10 years on what the impact of this program was. But what that means is that we have to withhold something that might benefit people from the control group forever. And in this case, that seemed particularly unfair. And so we made the decision that it was more important to give people who've been allocated to the control group the opportunity to participate in creative mentoring in the future than it was to retain the option of looking at long-term outcomes when we had no concrete plan or justification for doing that. And lastly, this has been cleared by the King's College London Research Ethics Committee, which gives us a very hard time about this kind of research and holds us to very high ethical standards. They don't default to approving this form of research. You really have to convince them that that this is both an appropriate and a robust method, and that you are looking after the interests of participants at the same time. So the fact that we have been able to take this through the Research Ethics Committee and get approval, I think should give some confidence that we're really thinking about the needs of the evaluation and the interests of participants. And then why this matters to creative mentoring. So there is very little existing research offering causal evidence on mentoring, creative interventions, the two together, and the benefits of those for care experienced young people. And I think that, we are seeing persistently the reduction of funding and support to arts-based interventions because they lack the kind of research that policymakers feel is compelling in terms of funding. And so a robust evaluation of something like this could be huge in terms of sort of directing funding towards arts-based interventions, mentoring interventions, interventions that work, and creative mentoring specifically, which, as I said, we kind of came to this evaluation with sort of a background of interest in the role of the creative arts, and so that was really attractive to us. Because What Works for Children Social Care has funded us to do the evaluation, there are no real changes in terms of the way that the program will be delivered, and no additional resources are needed in terms of it shouldn't be substantially more. Basically, the Mighty Creatives is receiving funding support to do this evaluation. Where programs are oversubscribed, all we need to do is tweak the recruitment process. And once this system is in place, it can be implemented over each tranche of creative mentoring, and then the results aggregated across them. And using a rigorous mixed methods evaluation will allow us to show what works in creative mentoring, but also for whom, why, and in what context. So that is kind of my sketch of the kind of key points of the evaluation. I haven't covered some of the components in detail here, so I'm very happy to go back and give more detail on anything anyone is interested, or to take any questions.